All right, so I'm out here with the 2004 RX-330, and I had it gone in for an inspection and found out that my front caliper was seized, so we're gonna go ahead and replace that caliper. So all I've done at this point is remove the wheel. This is the caliper we're going to be replacing. It's actually should be pretty easy. We got a screw up here in the back, and we got one down here. You can see, I'm just going to take those two out, and then there's one here that holds in this brake cable. But I'm going to take these pins out first and then do the brake cable last, just so I don't make too much of a mess. One thing I'm going to add to this is to invest in air tools. An impact wrench and an air compressor, if you ever do work on your car, will make life incredibly easy. I have snapped so many bolts that were rusted trying to get things apart with hand tools, and it just doesn't rarely ever seem to be an issue with the air tools. So that is my Craftsman impact wrench. I've got a 14 millimeter on a swivel, which is going to be for those two bolts that hold the caliper in place. Those are both 14 millimeter. You don't want to put the weight of this on that line. You can just prop it up here for now, but you definitely don't want to hang the caliper from this hose. You want to keep the strain off of that. So next, I'm going to take this nut off, and some fluid's going to drip out when I do that. So I'm just going to get a little container and put it underneath so the fluid doesn't go down the driveway, but just goes into a little cup. Bolt that's holding in the brake line, that's also 14. So I'm just gonna pull that off. See, it takes zero effort with the air tools. Doing a brake pad job, you'd remove the wheel, you'd remove the caliper like we just did. The new pad, you'll see there's a little groove there, literally just pushes in. And that's how easy it is to change your brakes. You do that on both sides. The pads literally just snap into those clips. If the clips are rusty, these don't look bad. The pads were recently replaced. The old pads I'm taking out aren't that bad, but they were worn very unevenly. Because of the caliper, which was seized. It was only applying pressure on one side of the pad. So we're going to put the new caliper on, and we'll wrap this up. So putting this stuff back together, these were all the 14 millimeters. There's three. There's the one for the line, there's the top one and the bottom one. I always tighten everything by hand with the hand tools, just because when you're using the impact wrench, you really have no idea how much torque is being applied, and it's hard to determine. So when I put this on, I just put the screws in by hand. I keep them loose because sometimes you gotta line this thing up right. But we're just gonna get this all tightened down, and we'll be on our way. Also, one thing to note, when you're doing the brake pads, if that's all you're gonna do, when you take this caliper off, it's just the top bolt and the bottom bolt, and then the caliper pulls off. You can leave the brake line attached if you're just doing pads. And also, I'm not sure with this car or not, a lot of cars you can just take the bottom bolt off or the top bolt off, and then just let the caliper kind of rotate out and drop down so you can access the pads underneath. So I am going to clean these up a little bit. You can see there's brake fluid, there's some brake fluid up there. Brake fluid can be really corrosive. So I'm just going to hit all this. Once you took the caliper off, you do have to bleed the line. This is a little Harbor Freight tool bleeder. It works good enough. Basically, you just stick that end in there, open the bleed valve. You have to have a helper for this. Before you open the valve, they're going to pump the brakes a few times, then press and hold, crack the valve for a second, close it, pump again, open it for a second, and then you just basically repeat that process until there's no bubbles going through the tube. It can also be helpful to keep the cap off of the reservoir when you're doing that, and keep an eye on the reservoir because you don't want that to run dry. So if you find you keep getting bubbles and it's taking a little while to bleed, you can take the fluid that comes out and just pour it back in. I've moved to the other side of the car, the passenger side. There was nothing wrong with that, but it turned out after I put everything back together and I took the car for a test drive, the brake pedal felt significantly better than it ever had in the past. which would lead me to believe that front caliper was in fact seized, and it's probably been seized since the day I got the car. No one recognized it. I brought it to 4 different mechanics, and I've asked them all if the brakes felt mushy, and they all said the car stops fine and that it's normal for an old car. Well, now the brakes feel like a brand new car. So that made me think that chances are that meant for the last year I've been driving this, only half the car has, only the passenger side has been doing all the braking. So sure enough, I looked at the pads, which were new when I bought the car a year ago, and they were pretty much almost down to metal. So I did decide I was going to go back and do those brake pads as well, since I had them in the set for the driver's side. So I had mentioned before that you know, in some cars you can get away with just swinging the caliper up. I decided it was just easier to take the 2 bolts off for one reason. This piston sticks out. As the pads wear, that piston goes out further and further and further. So it's necessary to bring that piston back in to get the new pads to fit. Otherwise, you won't be able to get the caliper over the new pads because they're a lot thicker than the old ones. So there's some tools, various tools that they make that you can use that are like clamps and stuff to clamp that down. What I find works well is I just take a bar like this and I just squeeze. And you don't have to squeeze with a tremendous amount of pressure, but if you just hold it very, very slowly, that will seat and you'll see that piston start to retract. Again, it's very slow, but it's always worked for me. It's not just going to squeeze in fast, and it's not about a lot of strength. It's just about equal pressure on both sides of that piston, and just maintain it, and you'll very, very slowly see that piston retracting. And also keep in mind to open the brake fluid reservoir. It may overflow if you topped it off and you had low pads. Now you pull this piston back and it's going to push a lot of that brake fluid back up into the reservoir. So just be prepared to maybe grab a turkey baster or something to suck out any excess.